Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to have you here today.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Good. We have a special guest today. Very interesting. It'll be by telephone, but it's a very important subject and with a very well-known author, David Talbot, and he's recently released a book called The Devil's Chessboard. And it's a subject that's we talk about a whole lot. And the overall subject is secret government. We don't like secret government. But also, his book deals a lot with Allen Dulles and the CIA and assassination of Kennedy. Of course, that is a big subject. So there's a lot of material there, and it's a fascinating book that he has, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to be wanting to read this. And there'll be a limited amount of time, so we can't do a whole lot. But first off, David, I want to welcome you to the program.
It's great to be here, Dr. Paul. Thank you.
Good. First off, I'll start off with a question, but Daniel, who's with the Institute with Peace and Prosperity, he'll have some questions too. But just in general, do you see your book as coming up with something brand new, or are we've had a lot of stories about the CIA and the assassination. Where do you put your book in what category? Is it more verification of what a lot of people have suspected? Is it an amount of degree that the CIA might have been involved in, and who was actually behind that? How do you put your book in that category? What role does it play?
Yeah, well, I think more and more people, Dr. Paul, are looking at this question of the deep state or the secret government, the sort of permanent circle of power that seems to keep running the country no matter who happens to be elected, and keeps us permanently at war with a very powerful surveillance state that keeps growing and growing, more and more Big Brother looking into everyone's business. And so this gives the backstory, so to speak, the historical backdrop for how this happened. And I look at the career of Allen Dulles, who in some ways was the most powerful and legendary spy master who America ever produced. He ran the CIA and our intelligence world through much of the Cold War. And many of the things that we're grappling with today, whether it's torture, extraordinary rendition, mass surveillance of private citizens, CIA black sites, and on, these actually have their origins not just after 9/11, but back in the reign of Allen Dulles during the Cold War. And I do produce a lot of new information because of getting access to documents that weren't available in the past. As far back as the World War II, we have, because of the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, which was passed by Congress, we now have access to a great deal of material that shows, for instance, how Allen Dulles and others collaborated actually with the Nazis before, during, and after World War II. Again and again, you see this pattern with men like Allen Dulles where they pursue their own interests and those of their clients rather than the interests of the United States or the president they happen to be serving.
David, hi, it's Daniel here. I think your book is an absolutely wonderful companion to Stephen Kinzer's wonderful book last year that Dr. Paul and I have both read and have been very interested in really painting a fuller picture of the Dulles brothers, and you're specifically on Allen Dulles, who you refer to, interestingly enough, it's a great term, crackpot realist. I think that's a fantastic term. But, it's interesting that most Americans don't believe the official story of the Kennedy assassination this number of years since it's passed. And I was listening to a recent interview you did with Lou Rockwell where you talked about how it was that Allen Dulles got himself put on the Warren Commission, which I think is fascinating. Could you tell some of our viewers about this?
Yeah, well, look, this is still the great taboo. Certainly in my profession, journalism, if you try to explore the Kennedy assassination, you're painted as a nut, as a conspiracy theorist. We all saw what happened to the filmmaker Oliver Stone years ago when he made his movie, JFK, in which he dared to say that the president was killed as a result of a conspiracy. But, look, this was the official government conclusion that Congress came to back in the 1970s. We forget about this. In the late 1970s, the House Select Committee on Assassinations did indeed come to the conclusion, after a lengthy investigation, that President Kennedy was killed as a result of a conspiracy. So this essentially overruled the Warren Report, which, of course, back in 1964, said that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone gunman, and that was the whole story, case closed. Well, we know the case is not closed. I present a lot of new evidence that suggests that Allen Dulles himself, after Kennedy fired him, after the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in 1961, Allen Dulles didn't get the memo. He basically went home to his home in Georgetown and continued to operate as if he were still running the CIA. He met with a number of CIA deputies and agents, a number of whom were actually identified by the House Assassinations Committee as suspects in the killing of Kennedy. And one of the key people I focus on is William Harvey. William Harvey was the head of the CIA's assassination team. He was promoted to that position by Allen Dulles. He was the one who was given the task of recruiting the mafia and working with the mafia to try to kill Castro. He built a very lethal killing team. They weren't able to get Castro, but they did kill many others all around the globe. I believe, and I present new evidence, that William Harvey brought that killing team home to Dallas, and with the tragic results we know that happened there on November 22nd, 1963. So Dulles then, conveniently after the assassination, by the way, he spends that weekend at a remote CIA facility in Northern Virginia known as the Farm, not at home watching TV like the rest of us. He's been retired, forced out of the CIA 2 years before, but suddenly that weekend that Kennedy's being killed and then Oswald's being killed conveniently, he's stationed at a CIA facility. He then gets himself, through lobbying and arm twisting, he gets himself appointed to the Warren Commission, the investigative body looking into the crime. LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, appoints him to that. And he so dominates that inquiry that many people thought the Warren Commission should have been called the Dulles Commission.
David, a couple of years ago when I was still in office, I made a statement, which on occasion when I was in office I would make statements that would draw attention from other people. But my statement was, I believe there was a CIA coup of our government. And for a lot of people that was extremism, but in many ways, I just was looking especially at foreign policy and how they dealt with foreign policy and getting us involved overseas. And that disturbed me a whole lot. But a long time ago, I met an individual and got to know him, and he was an FBI agent. At the end of World War II, his job was to screen people to go into the CIA, the newly formed CIA. And he did this, and he told me that he had two stacks. One, be careful with these guys. These guys are bad guys. And these guys over here are, patriotic Americans. And he said when they did that, they went and picked the individuals that he thought were very suspicious. And that just seems to be, extreme. So are these extreme thoughts that I've had, or is arguing that there could be a coup and there's really a secret government that is more powerful at times than our government that we recognize?
Well, I think, Dr. Paul, you were one of the few members of Congress who had the courage to speak out and essentially articulate what I think will become eventually the historical consensus in this country. Of course, there's major pushback from the media elites today and political elites. They don't want to shed a light on this taboo subject, because when you contemplate the idea of the CIA conspiring to overthrow a president and killing that president in broad daylight on the streets of an American city, it's such a traumatic thing, I think, for certainly the political system to try to absorb that fact. But that is where the evidence points. More and more people, more and more historians and journalists are now getting the courage to examine the documents, to interview, to go through the oral histories. I interviewed a number of people who did work in intelligence and who were the sons and daughters of legendary CIA officials who served with Allen Dulles, including Allen Dulles' own daughter, who is going through the same process that I think the country needs to, trying to grapple with this history and what her own father did in the name of national security. And essentially what we have in this country is a secret government that has consistently undermined our democratic institutions and driven out of office responsible representatives of the people who do try to get at the truth. And, it's time for us all to say enough. There's 1,100 key documents that the CIA is still withholding that relate to the Kennedy assassination. They're withholding these documents. They wouldn't give them to me or any other journalists who've been, through the Freedom of Information Act, trying to get access to these documents. They keep defying the law. There's a law known as the Jfk Records Act that compels all federal agencies to release documents related to the Kennedy assassination. So the CIA year after year has failed to do this. Now, when your own government breaks the law this way and robs the American people of its own history, and we have a right to this history, then we need to start thinking about taking more aggressive action as a people and really creating the kind of furor and storm of protest that did result after Oliver Stone's film came out many years ago in a new law, the Jfk Records Act. And now we need to make sure that the CIA actually obeys that law.
Now, David, you're known as a real media innovator. In the mid-'90s, you created an online magazine that, fascinated all of us. The idea that information could be freely available on the internet, really brave investigative work, and all sorts of features. You know that very well that a free society really depends on an independent media. You're probably aware of this German editor-in-chief of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, who said last year that I forget how many he said, but a great number of journalists throughout the world are really essentially on the CIA payroll and are essentially given the text that they need to write up. Do you think he's overstating the fact, or do you think there's something to this idea of CIA infiltration of the media?
No, I think he put his finger exactly on it. Carl Bernstein, the famous Watergate reporter, broke this story back in the 1970s for Rolling Stone magazine. Tellingly, of course, his own newspaper, the Washington Post, wouldn't run it. And in the story, he named the names of dozens and dozens, over hundreds of journalists who worked for, in various capacities for the CIA. And actually, in some cases, were on the CIA payroll. So the CIA, ever since the age of Dulles, has run a very effective secret media operation to spin the news, to spin the media, to manipulate the media. And, a lot of people thought, well, that was the old days, that was the Cold War. Well, this German editor, of course, brought us up to date on that. That propaganda machine continues to go on. We see its effects in Hollywood, the way the CIA is portrayed in movies and TV shows. And we see it in the news coverage of wars like in the Middle East and so on, and the Patriot Act here at home, and the drone campaign, and all these things that the American people should be getting more information about. And often that news is manipulated by intelligence agencies. In fact, I have a new book imprint called Hot Books with the New York publisher Skyhorse. And we'll be releasing next year a book by a very good investigative journalist named Nick Scow called Spooking the News. And Nick has done some deep investigation into exactly how the CIA and the NSA and other agencies do manipulate journalists and get their version of the truth disseminated throughout the U.S. media.
David, I think we have time for a few more shorter answers, shorter questions too. But tell me how you look at the military-industrial complex. Does the CIA get involved directly, or are they just the typical lobbyists who go and lobby for their interests, or do they get involved in manipulating the information so that there's always a military need to spend more money?
That's the way it seems, doesn't it, Dr. Paul? There's always a permanent crisis in this country. Dan earlier referred to C. Wright Mills, quote, the wonderful sociologist in the 1950s who taught at Columbia and wrote the book The Power Elite, which was one of the first really penetrating kind of looks inside this permanent government, the secret government. And, Professor Mills wrote that such people as these, referring to the military-industrial complex types and the Dulles brothers and so on, are crackpot realists. In the name of realism, because they're always saying, well, you have to look at the world, as this place of, constant global threats. But in the name of that kind of hard-headed realism, they've created a paranoid reality all of their own. And by the way, that's a paranoid reality that the American people have been forced to live within throughout my life, and I'm 64 years old, and I fear throughout my children's lives as well. It goes on and on, the Cold War, the War on Terror. There's always a boogeyman. There's always someone who's threatening us, and that justifies this enormous expenditure of American treasure and blood and resources, and of course continues to antagonize much of the world. And so it is a self-perpetuating machine where we keep creating more enemies than we kill.
Right.
At some point, the American people, again, have got to say enough. And it just, I think, is appalling that with very few exceptions, if any, perhaps your son, Dr. Paul, no one is in the presidential campaign is really bringing up this sort of permanent state of war, this permanent state of surveillance and secrecy that is the anathema to a healthy democracy.
Could we live in this country without the CIA, or do we have to have just modification of the CIA?
Well, President Kennedy, after the disaster CIA invasion of Cuba, and by the way, right on the heels of that, he had to deal with another CIA crisis in April 1961, where President de Gaulle, our ally in France, suddenly was shrieking that the CIA was backing a right-wing French military coup against him. So, I mean, this mischief was constant during the Kennedy era and continues up to this day. But can we live without the CIA as constituted today? Yes, I do think that. And what President Kennedy was trying to do after the Bay of Pigs invasion and this French crisis was to radically reshape and rebuild the CIA, make it more of an intelligence gathering operation and less of a covert violent operation. In fact, that's what Harry Truman, as you know, President
Right.
Truman originally intended when he made the CIA.
Yeah.
And he later said that he created a Frankenstein. He had no intention that the CIA should be going around the world overthrowing governments. And he wrote an op-ed piece in the Washington Post after the Kennedy assassination saying now the CIA has become a mortal threat to our own country, our own democracy.
Well, David, we could go on, and this has been very fascinating, and thank you once again for being with us. And the book is The Devil's Chessboard, and I find it very fascinating, but thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Dr. Paul. It's been a pleasure.
Very good. And I want to let the people know in the audience that this book is a very fascinating book. If you want to know the truth and you want to know more about the CIA, and really the big picture as far as I'm concerned is secret government. And we have too much secret government. The government was there, it was supposed to be designed with a Fourth Amendment to protect our privacy. Well, we don't get protection of our privacy. The government gets protection of their secrecy, whether it's monetary policy or economic policy or whatever. It's very, very secretive and very, very powerful, and this is the reason why exposure is necessary, and books like this are key to it. So I really appreciated David Talbot for coming on today, and check it out. Check out The Devil's Chessboard. And thank you very much for tuning in today to the Liberty Report.